Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and today is a sad and happy day. We're going to be talking about Hyperion. I know that I had mentioned, or normally I only do these episodes on Sundays, but this particular week, I didn't realize this, but apparently I was on the last chapter of the book, so it actually just kind of worked out to where I decided that it was time to finish out the book, and I wanted to go through what I thought was going to be this chapter and then another chapter. Turns out this was the last chapter. There's only 6 chapters, but each one is like 200 pages worth of chapter in the book, or somewhere close to that. So we got to hear the consul's tale and supposedly the ending of the story? ? I'm just going to tell you, it doesn't end the way that you want it to. So if you haven't read it yet, if you haven't read the book yet, when you do read it, it will definitely end in a way that is surprising and simultaneously incredibly frustrating, but also ultimately really, really good, and kind of really shifts the commentary from what we originally thought it was going to be to something completely different, which I thought was great. Before we get into this, I wanted to make a recommendation to y'all. I know a lot of us love Rick and Morty. One of the guys who made Rick and Morty also has made another show, Solar Opposites. It's not as good as Rick and Morty, if we're being honest with ourselves. We all knew that would be the case. But it's on Hulu, and there's lots of it to watch. It's at least one full season, so as we're kind of like, waiting on better content and trying to figure out what we're going to do with all of this free time that we now seem to have an abundance of. Thank you, COVID-19. It's not bad to have a new show to watch. So I would definitely check that out. In addition to that, read Hyperion. There's now like 6, if not 7, episodes on it. So there's really no reason for you not to give this book a shot and read through it and decide if you like it or not, I guess. I don't really know how else to phrase it. I definitely think it's worth a read by most anybody who likes science fiction. I definitely think it's incredibly well written. So I really didn't have any complaints about it other than it didn't end how I wanted it to end. So with all that out of the way, housekeeping stuff out of the way, we're going to get right into it. So Hyperion is a series of 6 short stories, really more like novellas, that are all an active part of one overall meta-narrative. And that meta-narrative is that there are 7 people who are traveling to a planet called Hyperion in order to see a being called the Shrike, in order to ask it, or in order to perform a final pilgrimage before the planet is overtaken by an external force or another civilization that is fighting against humankind, called the Ousters. They are one of 3 factions in Hyperion. Those 3 factions are the Ousters, the Technocore, and the Hegemony. And the hegemony, I don't know exactly how to say it correctly, are humans. The Ousters are humans who have evolved in space. They've lived in space exclusively for hundreds of years, so they have I don't think they have quite diverged from like human I guess, like the ability to breed with humans, so they're not like a new species, but there's no mention explicitly of whether or not ousters can interact with humans in that capacity, so I don't know. And then the Technocore are automated intelligences that are essentially, I guess, they're just, artificial, not automated. I mean, they are automated in some capacity, but so is any intelligence. Anyway, so they're artificial intelligences that have gained sentience and have multiplied in some capacity in order to form a substantial enough society to justify their own existence as a faction. So we have been reading the tales being told by the individual members within the party who is traveling to this world on this final pilgrimage. We heard from Father Hoyt, we heard from General Cassad, and then we heard from Saul Weintraub. That's 3. And then we heard from Martin Silenus. And then after Martin Silenus, we were supposed to hear from the member of the Templar, whose name again has escaped me. It was literally on the tip of my tongue until I had to say it, and then I totally forgot it. And then we get Braun Lamia's story, and she is a private investigator. I guess I should say what everybody is, just because we're at the end of the book, so I want to kind of review. So we had Father Hoyt, who is a Catholic priest. We had General Cassad, who is a general from the hegemony, military, or retired general from the hegemony military. We had Saul Weintraub, who is a scholar. We had Martin Silenus, who is a poet. We had the Templar gentleman, who is a member of a specific group of people called the Templars, who are human. They're clones, and they have some like telepathic abilities thanks to miscellaneous things. I'm not entirely sure how that works. At least not 100% sure how that works. And then we had Braun Lamia, who was a private investigator. And we had the consul, who is just a regular old human diplomat. And he was the person who drew the last number, which is awfully convenient in some capacities, because his story is kind of like, I think, serves as the overall commentary for the book that Simmons was trying to make. And so when they set out on this journey, they are told by Mia Gladstone, who is I guess they call her the CEO of the hegemony, or of the All Thing, which is kind of like this group of people who govern all of the hegemony. Everybody is told that there is a traitor amongst the group who is a spy for the ousters, and I haven't indicated who it is, because it may or may not be one of the individuals whose tales have already been told. So I just want to explicitly say there's a reason that I haven't mentioned it, and that reason is not because it's the last chapter in which it's mentioned. It's just because I haven't wanted to give away everything about this book. So there definitely are still a lot of twists and turns. I know I didn't give away like one of the primary twists for the first chapter. I didn't give away. And I haven't given away a lot of other stuff, so there definitely is plenty of reason to read this book, and I kind of wanted to keep it a mystery. I might kind of go over and review the big twists with the big spoilers at some point, but that just all depends on timing and things like that. So the chapter that we are ending with is the chapter during which the consul tells his tale, and we don't get to learn his name, or we haven't learned his name. He's been kind of like our main character / kind of like the person whose viewpoint it kind of feels like a lot of the story is from. And I think that that's like part of the reason that he ends up going last. Again, I also think that like his story is the one that's most important to what it is that Dan Simmons is trying to say about individuals and about the human race in general. And so we get to the end, and we find out that, there's always a little bit of exposition and world building at the beginning of each chapter. So at this beginning of this particular chapter, there's a lot of discussion about the war that is going on literally above the heads of the people who are on this pilgrimage. There's been 2 nights in a row that they saw spaceships exploding in orbit. And that's a big deal. because it means that the ousters are getting closer and closer, and as soon as they land, everybody who's there is in jeopardy, and that is a problem. So we are definitely getting closer to the, the resolution, if you will, of this particular story and everybody involved. And they are on the final leg of the journey to the time tombs, and they actually see, so as I mentioned before, we only got the tales of 6 people, because one of the people who was supposed to tell their tale mysteriously disappeared on the night that they first saw the battle occurring in the sky. And they believe that they saw him up ahead of them to in the journey to the time tombs. So they looked through some binoculars, they saw a figure walking, and it appears that he was able to somehow maneuver his way into being ahead of them and traveling beyond where they were. So it definitely, there's an indication that this individual has something deeper to do with the plot than everybody else does. So there are sequels to this book, and his tale is not told. So I'd imagine that something that he did or what have you is part of what the next book or the other books are about. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to keep talking about the last chapter of Hyperion as well as the epilogue at some point. We'll be right back.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Chapter of Hyperion as to where exactly in their pilgrimage the individuals who are traveling to make requests of the Shrike as one final pilgrimage is being performed. They're talking about sorry, I apologize, got a little tongue-tied there. We were talking about the exposition that Simmons is giving us as to telling us exactly where they are in proximity to the time tombs and therefore the Shrike. And what we find out is that they're pretty much a day away from the time tombs, which I find to be incredibly interesting because I don't know why Simmons would end the book at that spot, or at the spot that he does, when they're only a day away from the time tombs. I will say, I try not to give too many spoilers away about the end of the book. They don't end up going to see the Shrike at the end of the book, which means you pretty much have to read at least the next book. Though I wouldn't be surprised if the next book is like some weird thing where they're actually traveling backwards and you end up hearing more stuff about this thing or that thing. So I don't know. I'll do some research and let y'all know. I definitely will be reading it, but I don't know if I'll be talking about it. I've heard from a couple people who have read the whole trilogy that the second two books aren't nearly as good as the first one. So we'll have to see. There's definitely a lot in this first book as far as like reference and allusion is concerned. I think that you could almost fill an entire novel with all of the references that Simmons makes as we're going through this journey. And not just straight up references to individuals in like our general lexicon, but references and allusions that are much more subtle to things that we are familiar with. So ultimately, there's just a lot to unpack in this book. And I know I said that on Sunday of this last week. It's because there is just a lot. So that's where we're at as far as the journey to the Shrike is concerned. They arrive at the top of this mountain range, and they are just basically have to descend into the valley, and in this valley is where the time tombs are. They get to this hotel that's supposed to be the place where tourists were going to go before they went and saw the time tombs, and it's just completely ransacked. Everybody has been murdered, or at least killed in some capacity. Murdered has certain implications, and they never confirm or deny those implications firmly enough for me to draw a conclusion about them. But we end up at in this hotel where everybody is dead, and they have to find a place to sleep. And as they try to find a place to sleep, they kind of start hearing some noises, and they don't know exactly what's happening, and then nothing's going. They end up finding out nothing is going on, or at least that's what Cassad says. But again, I have a hard time trusting anybody in this particular book. I had thought for sure that this chapter would be kind of like a respite, and there was going to be 7 chapters in the book, but I was wrong. Unless you count the epilogue as a chapter, there are only 6, which I find to be odd because, again, a lot of this book has been focused on specific numbers because there's a certain superstition surrounding the Shrike, and it seems like the book is almost written in a way that someone who worships the Shrike would write it. It's just very interesting the way that it's been being handled by Simmons. The whole thing is written very poetically, and it feels almost like some sort of like epic. But that is also in part due to the fact that it is based, and stylistically at least, off of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which are, kind of like a similar series of like short-ish stories that are designed to tell an overall narrative or an allegory of some sort. So we get to the consul's story, and he is the last person who's going to tell a story, and we find out that he is not going to tell the story of himself. He's going to tell the story of his grandfather, which is, I guess, relatively important, but ultimately the story isn't even really about his grandfather. The story is about his grandmother, but the only way in which we're able to kind of learn about his grandmother is from his grandfather, because, well, he does something similar to what Father Hoyt does, and he pulls out a journal, which it's interesting that Simmons bookends the novel in this particular way. He pulls out a journal that's got like a digital journal that has recorded journal entries by an individual in it, and the journal entries are recorded by the grandfather. Well, the grandfather is recording these journal entries on a very, very old vid recorder because it is the vid recorder of his love, who is the grandmother of the consul, a woman named Siri, and she has left him this journal after deleting most of her stuff out of it for him to write down the rest of his life. And what we find out about the consul's grandfather is that he worked on the orbital platform above a planet called the Maui Covenant. And the Maui Covenant is called the Maui Covenant because it is basically a giant tropical planet with that is comprised by a giant sea and a series of islands. But the islands are living in some capacity. They're like a fully formed organism in some way. And the original colonists who went to that world, they took and reproduced dolphins on that world. They felt very strongly that, they wanted to try and take the mammals of the oceans on Earth and put them onto a new planet so that they didn't die out when old Earth was destroyed in what is referred to as like the accident of 68, I think, or something like that. The 68 accident or something along those lines. Basically, some sort of fluke caused a black hole to swallow old Earth in some way. And so as that was happening, people were trying to save different parts of old Earth and take them to new planets. And so dolphins got taken to Maui Covenant, and a lot of people kind of adopted the lifestyle of the islanders from Hawaii on old Earth, because the planet is full of islands that are constantly moving because they're living organisms. So they call them tree sails, but it's like an evolutionary adaptation by this organism that allows them to travel and like feed accordingly. But the islands end up being herded by the dolphins, so they form a symbiotic relationship, which kind of contributes to like this weird sense of purposefulness within everything that occurs in each individual story. When they're talking about how it is that they ended up going to Hyperion, there always seems to be this weird set of happenstantial circumstances that have all contributed to their eventual journey to Hyperion, which I found to be very interesting and like done very well. That's something that I, kind of was unexpected from Simmons, in my opinion. So we're going to keep talking about this chapter right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hyperion. There's a lot of exposition that goes into being able to talk about this particular chapter, so I do apologize if I'm taking a little while to get there. One of the biggest things and most important, well, no, let's not go there yet. So right before the break, I was kind of talking about how the world had been colonized by individuals who kind of had adopted a little bit of the island culture from Hawaii, and just the general, like, Pacific Islands as a whole, but it is called Maui Covenant, so I believe that Simmons is kind of trying to specifically make mention of Hawaii, especially considering a big part of what this story is about. So the story is about a gentleman by the name of Marin, who is the grandfather of the consul, and Marin is he starts out as a worker on the orbital platform that is kind of serving as like a midway point / like a farcaster. Farcasters are, it's not really clear what farcasters are. It seems like they're kind of like teleportation devices would be the best way to phrase it. They can take people from one world to the next, and they can they eliminate the need to travel via spaceship, because when you're traveling in space or via spaceship in any capacity, you incur substantial amounts of time debt. So, like, for instance, the Marin's character is, throughout this story, he's kind of bouncing all over the place as far as, like, what he's talking about. And the reason for that, you find out at the end of the chapter, is that he is recording this as a journal. And so it's kind of like a journal of, this is what happened at this time, and this is what's happening now, and this is what happened at this time, and this is what happened and is happening now. So it kind of feels more like just like a general set of memories rather than like a journal of like, this is what happened today, and this is what happened the next day. So there's a lot of different things that are kind of like occurring all at once. So there's several different stories that are kind of, I guess, corroborating together to eventually tell us like the overall narrative of this particular entry into Hyperion. And so we find out that he is a worker on a ship that is orbiting or is somewhere near the Maui Covenant the Maui Covenant planet, and has a specific, it's specifically tied to the Maui Covenant in some way or another. So ultimately, Maui Covenant is kind of like serving as not necessarily a home base, but it is the purpose, because Maui Covenant, or purpose of the mission, because Maui Covenant is going to be incorporated into the hegemony, or at least some part of the hegemony, and they, the colonists are not totally sure that they feel completely comfortable with that particular idea just yet. There are a number of people who are fine with it, but a lot of the people who are there's a substantial number of people who are not okay with the idea of incorporating themselves into the hegemony. So, but there's more on that later. But the journal is just miscellaneous entries by Marin. So Marin is, we find out, living a much longer life than Siri, who is the original owner of this journal. and Ciri is also his love interest, and she is kind of who the entire chapter is kind of based around, as well as kind of like the motivations for the consul are based around similar motivations to hers. And the whole thing is kind of really based off of Romeo and Juliet. Not the whole book, just this particular chapter has a ton of parallels with Romeo and Juliet. And I probably only noticed them as much as I did because I've recently been watching a lot of things that have a ton of parallels with Romeo and Juliet. So I think that's kind of interesting in a way. It seems that a lot of writers really like to reference Shakespeare as, especially Romeo and Juliet, like, oh, these two people fell in love and they shouldn't have fallen in love and now someone's dead, oh no, and no one's communicating this big giant secret. And that is kind of like the basis of a lot of things in this book, is that someone's not communicating this big giant secret. And so we get, of course, that same parallel in this particular chapter. And the big indicator of that is that when Meryn first meets Ciri, it's at this party that he and a gentleman named Mike have snuck out to, and Mike dies in a sword fight with Ciri's cousin. And Ciri is the woman that Meryn falls in love with. Mike is Meryn's very good friend. So Mike dies on Maui Covenant in a sword fight, and Meryn then brutally murders the person who murdered Mike, and does so in front of Ciri, which I think is interesting, that Ciri is in some capacity totally cool with being lovers with the guy who killed her cousin. But that's neither here nor there. Again, Romeo and Juliet references abound. But the nice thing about Meryn and Ciri's relationship is that it actually kind of pans out in some capacity, despite the fact that whenever Meryn leaves, it's only like a few months his time, but it's years planet-side for Ciri, because of the time debt that Meryn is constantly accruing by being out in space and traveling around and being a shipman. He essentially kind of misses out on the the childhood of all of his, actually the life of all of his children. His children kind of grow up and, they do everything without him, because he is gone for 10 and 11 years at a time, and like 20 years at a time. It says that he only sees Ciri 6 times, I believe, which is funny that that's how many chapters there are in the book. I just realized that as I was saying it out loud. He sees Ciri only 6 times. On the 7th time, he returns to the planet, she has passed away, and he is only 24, I want to say, and they met when he was 19. So only 5 years have passed his time, but 60 years have passed in standard years have passed her time. So she definitely she lives to a very ripe old age, and Meryn kind of gets to avoid aging with her, and kind of, gets to achieve this like quasi-immortality, which they do talk about at the beginning of the chapter, which I find to be interesting. Meryn compares himself and everyone else who's shipmen to gods when it comes to their like juxtaposition against the locals and the colonists, because they live so much longer, and they're kind of like demigods who are traveling back and forth from like, Olympus or like the pantheon of gods down to planet side. And he makes specific reference to the fact that his friend kind of looks like the Buddha. So there's a lot of that like religious commentary that we've been seeing throughout this novel that's occurring here. And I do think that Simmons is kind of trying to make the point that like ultimately people are kind of like their own gods in some way, but that's neither here nor there. And I don't want to get into that theological discussion. A lot of you probably wouldn't necessarily love my opinion. And that's not what I'm here to give you. I'm not here to give you my opinion on that. I'm here to talk about this book because it's so darn good. So Mike is the one who inspires Meryn to go to this party, which they were actually forbidden to go to because they're not supposed to interact with colonists on the planet, but they end up deciding to go, and that is where Mike is murdered, and Meryn retaliates And something pretty interesting does come of that, and we're going to talk about it right after this next quick.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello again, everybody, and we are back to talk more about the last chapter of Hyperion. Right before the break, I was kind of mentioning some of the parallels between this last chapter and Romeo and Juliet. Had mentioned specifically that there were basically direct references in this chapter to Romeo and Juliet because of the presence of, I guess, fratricide? I don't know, familial killings. It's pretty, that's very Shakespearean. Everybody in the family kills each other. But no, the love interest Ciri, her cousin is killed by Marin because her cousin killed Mike, who was Marin's friend. What we find out is that Mike is killed by a group of people named the Separatists, and the Separatists are a group of individuals who do not want Maui Covenant to be incorporated into the hegemony. And the reason that they don't want Maui Covenant to be incorporated into the hegemony is because they believe that the hegemony kind of represents this, I guess, vanilla way of living. It lacks awareness for other individuals, and it kind of represents, to Simmons, at least as far as I can tell, it represents the height of what it is that humanity is when they're unaware. And so I think, there's 2 or 3 major commentaries happening throughout this chapter, none of which are the commentaries that have happened in other chapters, which I think is interesting. Though I will say, I guess some of them have happened in other chapters. They've just been much more subtle. And he kind of distracts you from these particular commentaries by, presenting not more interesting, but just different philosophical concepts. So ultimately, I would think, after hearing this chapter, this book is kind of Simmons' commentary on basically his predictions of how mankind will expand into the universe. And ultimately, it's also kind of Simmons' commentary on history and things like that. There, at the end, in this last chapter, we find out that there is a grand scheme that occurred around the destruction or the loss of old Earth that we are made aware of the details, or made aware to the details of, in a way that kind of is repetitive to the way that history has been handled in the past, and Simmons would be well aware of that. And then in addition to that, there is kind of this idea of a critique of manifest destiny in a pretty profound way in this chapter. And lastly, there's just a critique of humanity in general. There is just a lot to say. I know I've said that the last 2 podcasts, so I do apologize. But Ciri, we get to the end of the chapter. I don't really need to tell the whole story throughout the entire chapter because the whole story is beautiful and well written and provides a lot of character development, but ultimately it doesn't really serve to advance the plot in any capacity. It does seem kind of oddly I don't know, I'm not going to say pernicious, but there's a lot of the kind of subtle little things that happen throughout the chapter where we are kind of oh, this person is actually this. And what we find out at the end of the chapter is that Ciri and her lover, Marin, I guess we could call him a husband in some capacity, the father to her, I think, 3 children. They have 3 boys together who are all 10 years apart because Marin has to leave every time, and his leave of absence takes 10 years. And so, like, after their first reunion, I don't think she doesn't get pregnant after their first reunion. It's after her second reunion that they get pregnant. And the second reunion is brought upon by the fact that he's kind of become like a local legend because he snuck off of a Hyperion, not seed ship, I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically the orbital platform that everyone is working on that's like a few hundred light years away from the planet. He was able to sneak off of that and then land and somehow get to this party where he wasn't even supposed to be. So it was definitely like a big deal that he was able to do it. And then an even bigger deal that he just like kills this guy in cold blood for being a separatist. And so there's just kind of like, he's got this weird mythos about him as he kind of goes throughout the colony. So when he goes back towards Maui Covenant after, 10 years ship time, they basically tell him, you need to go down planet side because you're kind of a legend now. And that's how he gets to see Ciri again. But he only gets really a slap on the wrist after he and Mike sneak off the ship, which is relatively surprising because they made it sound like he was going to get kicked off the ship completely, and he did not. So that was interesting for sure. So we find out that at some point during Ciri and Marin's life, one of their sons is killed because one of their sons has decided to become a separatist and doesn't want the hegemony to incorporate Maui Covenant into the hegemony. They want Maui Covenant to remain independent. And so the son who is involved with the separatists, we find out that he and his mother were actually working together in some capacity. Like, she knew that he was a member of the separatist movement and was okay with it in some way. There's really no indication of the fact that, like, Ciri is actually a separatist until the very, very end of the chapter. And the crazy thing about this is that's not even the big twist, really. There's an even bigger twist that kind of is just even better, so I'm not worried about giving away some of the little ones. But we find out that she is a separatist at the end of the chapter, and we find out that Marin has also adopted the ideas of separatism, and the Farcaster took like 50 or 60 years to build on the planet, and we find out that on the day of this like anniversary of a funeral or something like that they're going to open up Marin's tomb, and in Marin's tomb will be Marin, and she'll have been in like a time pod essentially that will have like reversed her age, and she'll have been hibernating until she could be young again, so she could get to spend more time with Marin because, they loved each other. What we find out is that Ciri specifically instructed the people around her to let her die and then to be cremated so that they couldn't do anything with her body or try to bring her back. And then she leaves these video recordings for Marin. But what we find out is that prior to Marin even entering the tomb, Marin had also decided to become a separatist in some way, and so Marin sabotages the Farcaster portal prior to its initial opening. And what was supposed to happen was Marin was supposed to go into Ciri's tomb, and Ciri had become like very well-renowned with not only the locals but also with the hegemony. They used her as like a diplomat, and they sought advice and things from her in a lot of ways just because she had an abundance of wisdom or something along those lines. And so she is supposed to be the one who like comes out of the tomb and, is the signal of change on Maui Covenant, because once the Farcaster portal is open, then Maui Covenant will have been incorporated officially into the hegemony. And so that's supposed to be like this big turn. Well, because she was cremated, she's not there. And so Marin is the only one who comes back out of the tomb, which kind of surprises everybody. Well, not everybody, but Marin wasn't informed that his lover wasn't going to be there. But we'll keep talking about this right after another quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
The novel by Dan Simmons. So we are getting to the end of the book, and I kind of want to go over, I guess, what the ultimate statement that Simmons is making by the end of the novel, and what that is exactly. And I don't want to say that, like, you know, my interpretation is necessarily the best interpretation or the only interpretation even, but the kind of the statement that I feel like Simmons is trying to make is that as much as things seem to change, they ultimately kind of stay the same. So in Hyperion, the hegemony is hundreds, if not thousands. I can't remember. He mentions the specific amount of years a couple of times. I want to say it's like 500 or 600 years beyond like the year 2100 or 2200 or something like that. So it's something like just shy of 1,000 years in the future from now. So we are kind of just given this window into a specific aspect of human behavior that Simmons wants to comment on by like a number of different factors, but the primary factor is ultimately that this idea that as humans expand and take over things, ultimately what they do kind of like mindlessly is homogenize the world around them. And what I mean by that is it's given pretty good illustration in the story, this last story that is told by the consul. So what we find out is that Ciri has been a separatist the entire time that she was with Marin, and she was kind of playing this long game of, you know, the hegemony killed my son, the hegemony wants to incorporate my planet, and the hegemony, when they do incorporate planets, is ultimately not very kind to the planet that they incorporate. And it's not that they're not very kind necessarily completely intentionally. It's that the thing that ultimately drives this idea of not just colonization, but specifically hegemony colonization is the need for profit and leveraging of planets into resources in some capacity. There's a specific statement that is made by Simmons that says that once a petroleum-based economy has been established, it's impossible to unestablish that economy. And he basically says that because plastics and everything that is made from petroleum, plastics and pretty much everything that is been afforded to us by modern society is made by the specific resource, we end up relying on it so intrinsically that we're not able to move past an economy move into an economy where it is no longer a necessity. We are required in some capacity to always be reliant upon it. And that is one of the main reasons that the hegemony wants to incorporate the Maui Covenant. And there are a lot of individuals on Maui Covenant who are descendants of the original colonists. And these original colonists kind of have like a native mentality, if you will. I guess in some way, Simmons is kind of trying to say that everybody at some point who settles anywhere is a colonist in some capacity. And I think that he's actually kind of like really onto something with this, because even the individuals who did end up on like the Hawaiian Islands as a great example, even the individuals who did end up there it's not like they were born there, right? They were colonists on that island at some point themselves, and so they ultimately feel that they have some sort of claim to it, which, I'm not here to speak as to whether or not they do, right? I'm just saying that at some point everybody is a colonist, whether there were humans there before them or not. Someone is always a colonist and adopts a certain way of life or a certain way of thinking. And there are even, they call them the sea people, but the dolphins end up kind of being like the original colonists, if you will, in the view of the colonists, and they become a very important symbol. And Simmons makes this very grandiose statement that dolphins have a method of communicating that is beyond that of like non-sentient creatures, and if given the opportunity, they could become sentient if they were given enough time because of the development of their prefrontal cortex. And so on a planet that is entirely oceans, it's very easy, it could be potentially very easy for them to evolve in some capacity. And I think that that is kind of Simmons' statement, is that eventually things evolve if they're given the ability to, which is why the ousters are kind of considered like a whole different species, a whole different faction, because they have evolved in some truer way than humans have. Because humans have been perpetuating this system of capitalism and consumerism that Simmons is kind of ripping on. And that being the primary reason that they wanted to settle Maui Covenant is something that he's making a pretty heavy-handed commentary on. And even towards the end, again, on this note of humans kind of perpetuate and repeat history, part of the reason that Siri is a rebel is because she's also, or a separatist, is because she's also kind of adopted or appropriated, because I don't know if there's specific mention of the fact that, like, the people who originally colonized Hawaii were the ones who ended up on Maui Covenant. But there's mention specifically of what the United States did to Hawaii in her kind of like manifesto towards the end of the chapter, if you will. And everybody's manifesto is kind of like everyone in the separatist movement for the Maui Covenant, their manifesto is kind of like, well, you're going to try to like softly incorporate yourselves onto this planet. But like in your soft incorporation, what you're basically just going to do is like gentrify the entire place and therefore push out anything that could be considered alternative. And I think that is like the bigger thing that Simmons is trying to say, is that humans aren't necessarily setting out to be capricious in the way that they interact with new places, but that ultimately they end up doing more harm than good everywhere they go, because they have this ultimate goal of comfort and the false premise of progress that they kind of fall back on in a very mindless way. And as someone who loves mindfulness and is a very big practitioner of it, I think I kind of find it everywhere. So again, take this for what it's worth. But I think that a lot of what Simmons is saying is that when we don't acknowledge the things that our humanity causes us to subconsciously do, such as pursue comfort, pursue profit, pursue consumption, that we kind of subconsciously commit these evil atrocities, or consciously commit these atrocities in order to solicit those results. So one of the kind of statements that's made at the end of, or towards the end of this story, is that when the hegemony goes to colonize a new world, any kind of life that could be considered even remotely sentient, even remotely conscious of its own existence, by the time the planet is incorporated into the hegemony, that competition, quote unquote, has been completely eliminated. And so I think that Simmons is kind of trying to say, and he's paralleling this with the dolphins on Maui Covenant, that we as individual beings in the universe have decided that knowledge looks a specific way, and that anything that doesn't possess knowledge in that specific way lacks sentience. So we're going to take our last commercial break, and we're going to keep talking about that particular subject as we close out this podcast and the discussion on the book.
the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
So right before the break, I was kind of talking about what it is that I think Simmons is trying to overall say in this book, and I think it is summed up in the last chapter, though I don't want to say that that's the only commentary that he's making. Again, I've mentioned several times the religious commentary, philosophic commentary, all the sorts of things that are going on in this book, which there is a lot of. But I think that there is a presence of this idea throughout the entire book where there's just these kind of individuals who are interacting with the world in ways that are like either not mindful or not actualized. And so they're kind of like happenstantial. And I think that that's kind of like, it's a commentary that a lot of authors make on the idea of history in that it's not as like cut and dry as a lot of people like to think of it as being. So a great example of this, he makes reference to the idea of colonization, and a great example of colonization is, of course, like, I don't know if we have any international listeners, but we're majorly based in the United States. So is this idea of the United States and the way that we colonized this area. We colonized the United States by kind of like just I don't want to say like subverting, because there are ways in which we were straight up ruthless to not only other countries who had laid claim to certain areas, but especially to the native populations. The United States government was just absolutely ruthless with them, and not in like a good way. Even just using the word ruthless makes it sound like they were kind of like intentionally doing, which they were intentionally doing something in order to get what they wanted, but there's kind of like, ruthless isn't always as negative as I would like it to be, but like I think ultimately what Simmons is trying to say is that and what I would agree with is that like the ends don't really ever justify the means, and that's something that is it's kind of stated a lot throughout this novel in a lot of very kind of like subtle ways, which I think is just really cool and interesting. I am a big fan of this book. And a big fan of what it is that Simmons is trying to say. And again, I think that it's just something that a lot of authors kind of try to get at in their, they're trying to capture this like grand meta narrative of what it means to have the human experience and like why we should feel certain ways about certain things. And ultimately, I feel like a lot of them kind of fall short in the fact that they try to capture this thing that's larger than all of us, and they do it in a way that is so small. And Simmons does it in a way that feels much more like larger than life. It's kind of sensational, right? We have these 6 individuals, all of whom have these fascinating stories about their life, and each narrative is just as compelling as the last, and it all kind of circles around this one thing until we get to the very end, and then we realize that the one thing that's been being circled around this entire time isn't the thing that actually was being circled around. And it's funny that I use the word circled because there's specific mention by the dolphins on Maui Covenant that they miss sharks, and which I think is funny. I don't know if dolphins herd sharks. I've heard that might be something that they do, but they do herd the islands in Maui Covenant because the islands are living creatures, and so the dolphins have found a way to herd them. And so I find that to be very interesting. But though there is no mention of what the dolphins eat, so I wonder how they survive. Anyway, Random shower thoughts is what I'll call that. I'll chalk that one up to that. But we kind of end up in this place where, like, the commentary that really has been being made is that we as individuals are capable of these giant evils when it comes to, or when we're in a group. And not only are we capable of this, like, atrocious evil because of what, like, lies within us as an intrinsic part of being human, but there are external forces that are even more capable of evil in our own eyes. And ultimately, like, that evil that's enacted on us isn't really all that evil in comparison to the things that we do, but we just look at it so selfishly as to think, like, oh, how dare it, like, violate my particular thing. And even towards the end of the book, when we start finding all these, like, there's a bunch of twists and turns, none of which I'm gonna, like, reveal, because I think it's important to kind of keep some things secret. There's a bunch of twists and turns, and you as the reader are kind of left with, like, well, no one is really good in this book. There's really not a single person who has any kind of, like, good-heartedness in them. And then the one individual who seems to be probably the most evil is the one who seems the most justified in their behavior. And then they're the one who ultimately decides to say, like, actually, you know, I said that I was going to wish for one thing, and I'm actually going to wish for this thing from the Shrike, because you know, my interactions with it are the ones that caused it to be released. Because what we find out is that the person who was the spy was working with the ousters years and years and years previously. I don't know exactly how many years, but I think it's a certain number of years ago. And there was a device that they had found that was able to eliminate a certain amount of the entropic fields, or the anti-entropic fields that surrounded the time tombs, and released the Shrike. And so, because the Shrike was released in the future, it was released for all time. Because the time tombs move in reverse, and because the Shrike is associated with the time tombs, it is able to kind of maneuver throughout a lot of different places. And what I find to be very interesting and kind of frustrating about the book is that it feels like the Shrike isn't necessarily bound by Hyperion, but at the end of the book they make it seem like the only reason it isn't bound by Hyperion, or no, they make it seem like the Shrike would need a Farcaster in order to no longer be bound by Hyperion in any capacity. And I just don't think that that's true. I think that the Shrike is supposed to represent like a real living deity in some capacity, and so it kind of has different iterations throughout the entire galaxy at any given point, and like its influence is felt throughout the galaxy because of the way that it interacts with time. And time is such a universal thing, and numbers are such a universal thing in this novel, that I just really feel like it's kind of it's just not fully descriptive of exactly what the Shrike is supposed to be. But I don't know, Simmons could be kind of like trying to make us draw our own conclusions, or try to like set up a sequel, because like I've mentioned, the book doesn't end the way that you want it to, and that means that you pretty much have to read at least the next book in the trilogy in order to get like the final results of the story, if you will. So I will definitely be reading that, so I'll keep everybody posted as to when I do that. But what we find out is that the individual who was working with the ousters used a mechanism to release the Shrike, and that person is kind of like in some way responsible for a lot of the things that happened to everybody else in some capacity. But in the same hand, that person is not responsible for the things that happen to everybody else, because the things that ultimately happen to everybody else kind of seem to be this hodgepodge of happenstantial occurrences that ultimately added up to a bunch of individuals who had this one common thing to pursue, being in the same place at the same time. And to say that that was within the ruminations of the Shrike itself is kind of a sensational statement or way to look at it. So it's really confusing as to whether or not Simmons is trying to say like, well, they just accidentally all ended up here and that's just kind of the way that it is, or if he's trying to say like, no, everything's been intentional and this is this well laid out blueprint and none of it is happenstantial and it all has purpose. And I think that that's also kind of the gray area that he wants us to sit in, because I think that a lot of what he's trying to say is that things seem like they have purpose or seem like they might be, the means are worth the ends, but ultimately, depending on your perspective, they're not, and they aren't purposeful. Means are not worth the ends, and it just all depends on where you're standing and looking at things. And from the perspective of different individuals, certain things are worth it, certain things aren't worth it, and like ultimately we want to blame like God or say that fate has enabled this certain thing, or that like there's some person who's acting as like who unbeknownst to them is acting as a force of creation and bringing things into existence without intending to bring those things into existence. And like I think that chaos is kind of what Simmons is trying to get at in our understanding of the world, in that it is chaotic and that there are things that we just don't understand and can't understand, and that's kind of for good reason, because they might not have purpose, and the idea of knowing that things don't have purpose is terrifying, and it's kind of it's equally terrifying to what the Shrike represents, which is just kind of like this wanton destruction, which ultimately the awareness of the wanton destruction of the Shrike is only different from the wanton destruction of human beings because we're aware of it, and we're not aware of the destruction that we as humans cause to everything around us in the way that we destroy what is native, what is different, and what is presented to us as alternative forms of intelligence. And we kind of justify that by saying, well, we're human, or we have access to this specific kind of like holier than thou thing. So it's very interesting, and there's just a lot to it. So I might do kind of like another final review podcast on this where I kind of like try to connect everything. Not totally sure just yet. I might just start the next book. Might start a different book. So we'll find out on Sunday. But I just want to thank everybody for going on this journey with me. I should definitely at least talk about the epilogue at some point. So we'll probably cover that on Sunday for maybe the first half of the podcast. So we'll see. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Definitely make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Leave us a 5-star review. Stay safe out there. Follow your local ordinances. Some things are starting to open up here in California, so I imagine other places are opening up a little bit more rapidly because the population densities are less than what they are here. So good luck, everybody. Thanks again, and have a good week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.